The rain drummed incessantly against the window of Mark's office, each drop a somber echo of his unease. The space, usually a sanctuary of precision and control, now felt stifling, burdened by a growing sense of suspicion. The day had begun innocently enough with the discovery of a small, misplaced receipt from a restaurant. It wasn't the receipt itself that unsettled Mark, but the scrawled name on its back, Jason, written in a careless, unfamiliar hand. That single name tugged at a thread Mark hadn't realized existed, unraveling his carefully maintained world. By evening, Mark was driving home, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of fragmented memories. He sifted through moments from their life together, searching for answers. Sarah's recent trips to the city for networking events, her newfound enthusiasm for yoga retreats. Individually, they were unremarkable, even admirable pursuits for someone in her field. But Mark's finely tuned instincts, honed over years as an engineer thriving on identifying hidden flaws, urged him to dig deeper. When he arrived home, the house welcomed him with its usual warmth, but something felt subtly, indefinably off. Sarah was perched on the edge of the sofa, her fingers tracing restless patterns on the fabric. She looked up, her smile just a shade too bright. "You're home early," she remarked, her tone airy, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise. Mark set down his briefcase, his senses heightened. He caught a faint whiff of cologne, distinctly unfamiliar. "The meeting ended sooner than I thought," he replied evenly, his gaze steady. Sarah nodded, her movements a touch too deliberate. "That's nice. Dinner's almost ready." Over dinner, Mark studied her closely. The glances toward her phone, her barely touched plate, the forced casualness of her conversation. All of it screamed unease. The silence between them grew heavy, laden with words neither dared to speak. Later that night, as Sarah retreated to bed, Mark lingered in his office, the weight of his suspicions bearing down on him. But rather than confront her impulsively, he sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and began to investigate. He searched for the restaurant listed on the receipt, his fingers trembling with equal parts dread and determination. Social media quickly yielded its damning evidence. A photograph of Sarah seated across from a younger man, laughing with a lightness Mark hadn't seen in years. His chest tightened as he stared at the screen, anger and heartbreak warring within him. Yet, instead of exploding in rage, Mark leaned back in his chair, his jaw set with grim resolve. If there was one thing he excelled at, it was constructing a plan. The next morning, Mark rose early. The house was still cloaked in silence, save for the gentle hum of the coffee machine brewing in the kitchen. Sarah's absence from their shared bed was both a relief and a poignant reminder of the widening chasm between them. Today, Mark decided, would not be the day for confrontation. It would be a day for clarity and preparation. He settled at the dining table with his laptop, pulling up Sarah's recent credit card statements. With methodical precision, he cross-referenced her transactions with her calendar. The discrepancies were glaring. Lunchtime client meetings aligned with charges at upscale cocktail lounges. Yoga retreats corresponded to boutique hotel bookings 2 towns away. The pattern emerging before him was undeniable. Later that day, Mark reached out to Emma, his closest confidant. Emma had been his best friend since college, her loyalty as steadfast as the bond they shared. She answered on the first ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Hey, Mark. What's up?" "I need your help," he said, his tone grave. "And I need you to promise me discretion." Emma hesitated for only a heartbeat. "Of course. What's going on?" Mark summarized the situation with painful brevity. When he finished, Emma's anger flared on his behalf. "She's been playing you," Emma said sharply. "You deserve better." Mark understood Emma's anger, but he remained composed. "I don't want to act based on suspicions alone. I need concrete proof. Can you help me?" Emma's voice softened, the initial edge replaced with understanding. "You know I'm here for you. Just tell me what you need." That night, Mark worked late, preferring the solitude of his office to the strained atmosphere of home. Sitting at his desk, He unfolded a map of the city and marked locations tied to Sarah's questionable activities. Gradually, a clear pattern began to emerge, centering on a specific area downtown, a place Jason seemed to frequent. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. When Mark finally returned, Sarah greeted him with her practiced cheerfulness. She kissed him on the cheek, though the action felt mechanical. "You're home late," she remarked casually, though her eyes gave away a flicker of unease. "Work ran over," Mark replied, keeping his tone even. As they sat together, the weight of what wasn't being said pressed down on them both. Mark stole glances at her, noting every small movement and subtle change in her demeanor. How many times had he ignored these clues? How often had he told himself her explanations made sense? Now, each detail painted a different picture. The woman he saw before him was a stranger wearing a mask of familiarity. The days that followed were a blur of quiet determination. By midweek, Mark's briefcase held not project plans but evidence. Sarah's financial records, prints of her social media activity, and a USB drive with damning emails. Over lunch, he met Emma at a discreet cafe. She arrived carrying a file, her expression heavy with concern. "They've been meeting regularly," she said, sliding the file across the table. "Twice a week, at least, for the past 3 months. This isn't just a casual thing." Mark opened the file, methodically examining the photos and documents within. His hands remained steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The evidence was undeniable. Sarah and Jason sharing laughter, intimate gestures, and building a life separate from him. "Thank you," Mark said quietly, his voice tight with restrained emotion. Emma reached out, placing her hand over his. "You don't have to go through this alone. Whatever you decide, I'm here." Back at work, Mark studied the evidence again, committing each detail to memory. The betrayal wasn't a careless mistake. It was deliberate, a calculated deception spanning months. When Mark returned home that evening, Sarah was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she prepared dinner. The scene might have been comforting once, but now it only stoked a quiet rage within him. She turned to greet him, her smile faltering for just a moment before settling into a forced brightness. "You're back," she said lightly, her eyes briefly darting away. Mark set his briefcase down and leaned against the doorway, watching her. The mask she wore had begun to crack. He could see it now, her nervous glances, the overly cheerful demeanor. For weeks, he had let his doubts simmer, but the time for observation was ending. The truth she tried so hard to conceal would soon be exposed as she looked up as he walked in, her smile bright but strained, like a fragile mask. "You're home early," she said, her tone light, though an undercurrent of unease betrayed her. Mark placed his briefcase by the door, his senses on high alert. A faint scent lingered in the air, cologne, one that wasn't his. "The meeting wrapped up sooner than expected," he replied, keeping his voice measured while his eyes studied her. "That's nice," she responded with a quick nod, avoiding his gaze. "Dinner's almost ready." At the table, Mark ate mechanically, barely tasting the food. Sarah's voice filled the space as she shared details of her day, her words flowing too easily, too cheerfully. He barely registered them. His attention was elsewhere. On the way her eyes darted to her phone, the barely touched plate in front of her, the forced brightness in her tone. The picture was becoming clearer, piece by agonizing piece. Later, after Sarah had retreated to bed, Mark remained in his office. The quiet of the room only amplified the weight pressing down on him. Opening his laptop, he typed in the name of the restaurant from the receipt. It didn't take long for his fears to solidify. A social media post confirmed it. Sarah, sitting across from a younger man, her laughter captured in a way he hadn't seen in years. His chest ached as he stared at the screen, a cocktail of anger and sorrow swirling within him. But he didn't rush to confront her. Acting impulsively wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his mind working methodically. If there was one thing he excelled at, it was preparation. By the time Friday arrived, Mark's resolve was set as unshakable as the storm brewing inside him. Days of quiet investigation had culminated in a clear picture, and he was ready to face her. This wasn't about rage or retribution. It was about clarity, about reclaiming his life from the deceit that had seeped into it. When Mark arrived home earlier than usual, the golden light of the setting sun streaked across the walls, casting long shadows. Sarah was in the living room, scrolling through her phone with a glass of wine at her side. Her head snapped up at the sound of the door, her expression briefly startled. "You're home early," she said, her nervous smile faltering. "Is everything okay?" Mark met her gaze, his face unreadable. "We need to talk." Her smile disappeared, replaced by a look of wary apprehension. "Sure," she said, setting her phone aside. "What's going on?" Walking over to the bookshelf, Mark retrieved a leather-bound journal he had discovered earlier in the week. He placed it deliberately on the coffee table, the weight of its presence filling the room. "I came across this while organizing my office," he said, his voice calm but laced with sharpness. Sarah's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face before she quickly replaced it with feigned indifference. "That's private," she said, reaching for the journal. Mark's hand came down over it, stopping her. "It stopped being private the moment you filled it with lies and betrayal," he said evenly. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale. A tense silence stretched between them. "I know about Jason," he finally said, his voice steady and deliberate, her mouth open as if to protest, but no words came. Instead, she leaned back, her face ashen. "It's not what you think," she whispered. Mark's eyes didn't waver. "Then tell me what it is." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked away, her voice shaking. "It just happened," she said, barely audible. "I never meant to hurt you. Please, you have to believe me." Mark shook his head, his calm unbroken. "You didn't just hurt me, Sarah. You destroyed the foundation of everything we built together. For what? A thrill? A fantasy?" Her tears spilled over, her shoulders trembling. But Mark didn't flinch. "I thought we were happy," he continued, his voice tinged with bitterness. "I thought we were building a life together. But you were building something else, weren't you? With him." She buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. "I didn't know how to stop," she choked out. "I didn't know how to fix it." Mark straightened, his heart weighed down by equal parts sadness and resolve. "You didn't try, Sarah. You chose deceit over honesty, betrayal over trust. Now, you'll have to live with the consequences." He picked up the journal, his final gesture in the quiet room. Mark turned toward the door, his footsteps deliberate. "I'll be staying somewhere else tonight," he said without turning back. "When I return, we'll figure out the next steps. But remember this, Sarah. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed yourself." The door closed behind him with a soft but resolute click, leaving Sarah alone in the house that now felt cavernous and cold. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, suffocating in its finality. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains of the modest hotel room Mark had checked into. The stillness of the space, devoid of familiar memories, offered him a brief sense of peace. For the first time in days, the chaos in his mind began to quiet. He had spoken his truth, and while the road ahead was uncertain, the burden of pretending was no longer his to bear. At home, Sarah sat in the dimly lit living room, her gaze fixed on the journal Mark had left behind. It sat like an accusation on the table, untouched since the night before. The silence in the house was deafening, magnifying the emptiness she now faced. For the first time, she allowed herself to confront the gravity of what she had done, the hurt she had inflicted, the trust she had destroyed. When Mark returned that evening, his demeanor was calm but distant. They sat across from each other at the dining table, the weight of unspoken words between them. "I've consulted a lawyer," Mark said, his tone measured but firm. "We'll begin the process of divorce. I'll make sure it's fair for both of us, but but I won't be staying here while we work through it." Tears filled Sarah's eyes, spilling over as she reached for words that wouldn't come. Mark's expression remained unchanged, his resolve unshaken. "You need to figure out what you want," he continued. "Not just for yourself, but for the person you're going to be moving forward. I can't carry the burden of your choices anymore." As he stood and headed for the door, Sarah's voice trembled, breaking the stillness. Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" Mark paused, his hand on the doorframe. Slowly, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Forgiveness isn't something I can promise," he said quietly. "It's not a decision I can make right now. It's something that might come with time, if it comes at all." Without another word, he stepped outside. The cool evening air greeted him like a balm, crisp and refreshing against the heaviness of the past days. For the first time, Mark felt a glimmer of freedom, a sense that he could finally begin to rebuild, unshackled from the lies that had bound him.